Welcome, everyone, to the Umana Yana Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Drypal, and today I have a very special guest who I have yet to have the pleasure of meeting in person. However, I've been a big fan since the first time his work crossed my social media feed. I'm going to flip it on over to him to introduce himself, and then I'm going to introduce you to the conversation today, and then we're going to jump right on into it. Take it away, my friend.
All right, hey everybody, salam alaikum. My name is Djamil Ninsoo, better known as Djamil. If you know me on social media, it's Dogla Boy. Introducing myself is always a thing because I never know what to say. But I'm an author, so I recently published my second children's book. I'm a anthropologist by passion and that's what I'm in school for. I'm a museum archivist by trade. I also work in the arts, so I work with the arts nonprofit. I'm a part of Savory in the Indo-Caribbean, part of some young adult Muslim organizations as well. And at the root of it all, I'm a family guy, so a lot of folks know me for like my family-centered content with my nanny G. I'm an uncle of 21, so
Wow.
shout out. Yeah, that one always catches folks off guard, and I myself and about two other sisters have not had any kids, so that number could greatly, jump. But nah, that's me. I'm a regular guy who put my pants on one leg at a time, you know. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I guess more can come out as this conversation comes out.
Definitely. Wow. 2021. Okay. All right. That's a new record as I've seen it so far. So thank you for that already. So like I said, I've been a fan since the first time I saw your work. And, one thing that has really stood out to me about the things that you do put out into the world is that you can see that there's such a high degree of thought and intention that goes into it. I can tell, like, you as an author, and that's one of the many things that we have in common. We understand the power of our words and our word choices and things like that, right? Incredibly mindful. We understand how that can definitely shape our lived experience of things. And I think that really, is a nice segue into our conversation because today we're talking about a few things. You mentioned the book launch. So, we're definitely going to dive into that and your career as an author so far. We're also going to talk a bit about something that came up in our planning of this episode, which is the importance of alignment in what we do, right? What we give our energy to, our time, our resources, right? And how that can impact just about everything that we do. And, another thing that we want to dive into a little bit today is healthy communication between men, right? I think that we both have a lot of lived experience, and a lot of historical background to really see the trends that have emerged and maybe some cycles that keep repeating, within our cultures, within our communities. And so I think it's really important that we're having this one today because I think we have the potential to help people disrupt some of those cycles and perhaps leave a bit more empowered with how can I also create these shifts within my lineage. So I'm incredibly excited to get going with you, man. So, let's dive into the book, right? I've seen many different works come across your feed. And so, the most recent one, I wanna flip it over to you to tell us about that one because it really stood out to me as this piece that is so different from anything that I would expect to find, say, in my local chapters or Indigo, or even find online. So, what was the inspiration? Take me through that journey of from vision to creating it and having it right there in your hands, man.
Yeah, no, so my most recent project was ABCs for the Jamaican child. Jamaican, right?
All
Being a
right.
portmanteau of the Jamaican and American. And it honestly, it's first and foremost a love letter to Jamaica and its culture, its people, especially in the wake of Hurricane Melissa. But it's also a labor of love dedicated to my late sister who passed away in 2022, who styled me as her Jamaican brother because although I'm Jamaican, I grew up with American culture, right? So like there's just a thing like when they talk about like New York Jamaicans versus Florida
Yeah.
Jamaicans versus like the Toronto Jamaicans, but like to be Jamaican and then grow up in America is like its own like experience, right? But the book I would say comes from that experience. It also comes from an experience I had in grade school. So my early school years was at a predominantly Caribbean private school. I very much compare it to like if you're Jamaican, like Wolmer's and Immaculate, like it's one of them. And
Okay.
so my class, we did a performance that was the Jamaican ABCs. I'll never forget. I had the letter U. U was for ugly the fruit. And as I got older, right, and being Jamaican in South Florida is very, yeah, when you're overexposed to something, you kind of get satiated off of it, right? So like to be Jamaican in South Florida, everybody's Jamaican, everyone's been to Dutch Pot, everyone's been, one of my friends who came from Jamaica later in life was like, in Florida, everybody has a Jamaican grandfather, great grandfather, and I was like, you know what? You have a point, my friend. Like everybody has some type of connection to being Jamaican, right? And so
Right.
what I thought was interesting was that even in that everyone has some connection to Jamaica, I would mention certain things about my Jamaican experience and folks like some folks were like they've never had cowfoot, right? Or they
Mm.
didn't know what dukunu was, but they might know it as blue draws or tire leaf, right? And so as I got older, I was like, okay, it's interesting that we're all repping this flag, but like we don't all have the same lived experiences. And it's interesting now that, we're getting into the third and fourth generation Jamaicans who are born here. And some of the more I would consider simple, quintessential Jamaican things they just don't know about, right? Like I work with a girl, I'm only 27, she's 21, 22.
Mm.
We're in the same generation, Gen Z, but like it's like we're like from two different Jamaicas because like I'm talking about Miss Lou and my my son Uriah would preach and she's just like, who is that? What is that? And I'm like, you don't know Miss Lou? You can't know Patois and not know Miss Lou, right? So
Yeah.
this book, ABCs for the Jamaican Child, it started off very, very simple, right? In my head, it was just going to be A is for Aki, and then we had an illustration of Aki and I had a conversation with one friend and then that kind of snowballed into this new space of let's create like scenes for different food items. And then I took a step aside and said to myself, I kind of want this also not to just be the mainstream Jamaican culture, right? So for example, G, right? And when I had the book launch, I read the book aloud and I did this guessing game where I was like, all right, guys, can you guess what A is for? Can you guess what H is for? And when I
Yeah.
got to G, I said, can you guess what G is for? And folks were like, oh, Gizada, right? Everybody thinks G is for Gizada. That's like a very common Jamaican pastry. And I surprised them because I went G is for Gulgula. And folks were
Mm.
like, Gulgula, what's that? And I said, that's a dessert that the East Indians brought to Jamaica, right? So if you're not from a East Indian, like a very traditional old East Indian family or grew up around those types of families, you wouldn't necessarily know about it, right?
Got it.
And then for I did Ital stew because I'm thinking again of like the Rasta influence in Jamaica and that type of lifestyle. And so I did try to represent the mainstream aspects of Jamaican culture. A is for Aki, B is for breadfruit. But then even when I said C is for curry chicken, I mentioned white rice or roti, which
Ah.
when we talk about intentionality and word choice, a lot of my I guess I'd say my notoriety came from TikToks I made about East Indian culture in Jamaica. And in the very beginning, I used to speak in a lot of absolutes. So I would say, Jamaicans eat roti, Jamaicans do this, Jamaicans do that.
Mm.
And folks would push back and say, well, I'm Jamaican and I've never heard of this before. And I said to myself, all right, 14 parishes. And all these parishes have different districts and villages. They're not all the same. So I had to take a step
Mhm.
back and acknowledge, all right, so East Indian families in Jamaica do this, right? Or Chinese families in Jamaica do that. And make those distinctions so that way I'm speaking from a more honest perspective because that's the other thing, right? When I started saying things like Jamaicans eat roti, and if I'm the first Jamaican you meet, you're gonna go off of okay, this Jamaican says Jamaicans eat roti. When you encounter a Jamaican who's never had roti now, you get into this kind of consternation, and I that's the last thing I want. So I now always try to
Mm.
speak less in absolutes and more of like, all right, if you're from this area, this might be the norm. If you're from that area, that might be the norm. And that's coming from a St. Marian who the majority of my friends are from Kingston and St. Andrew. We're very culturally different.
Yeah.
I'm the country guy in the city friend group. So I always try to be mindful in all conversations, right? Where am I from? Where are they from? Let's try to meet in the middle.
Got you. Oh, I love that, man. And it sounds like such an interesting learning opportunity for everybody, right? Because like, with my family being Guyanese heritage, right? Like I
Mhm.
think about, what would an ABC book for that look like? Right? And I think it would turn out so different depending on who you ask to write it. Because I was even thinking about it the other day. I was like, okay, what are the main things that I think about when I think about my heritage, my culture, right? And I started to realize that they aren't even things that are directly tied to my culture. It's more the things that were, say, brought by the British into that geographic location, right? So, for example, you have like the caramel bars, right? So it's like, oh, well, then
Mm.
when you look at it, it's not like it's made in Guyana. So it's not really a Guyanese thing, right? And then, naturally, I think if we get to the letter V, right, what's everyone going to say? They're going to say VIX, right? But
Oh,
you know what I mean? But it's like, hang on, well, is that really Guyanese, or that's more the marketing of what it is to be Guyanese? You know what I mean? So I love how you did that, because like I feel like it's such a unifying thing, right? And you mentioned like not speaking in absolutes, and that's something I've been incredibly mindful to not do as well, because it does isolate some folks, right? It does bring about that whole like, am I enough type of conversation, when, that's the last thing any of us are trying to do, right? Like I find, like my generation and your generation, like we're kind of having this like return to the soul type moment, where we are incredibly curious about that elder wisdom that lives within those who, might not have all that much longer on the planet in this form, right? So I see like we're really trying to get that knowledge and, turn that into something that we ourselves would love to consume and make part of, the tapestry that is us, to carry forth within the lineage. So I think that this was so monumental, not only for your family and your community, man, but like just to set a tone of like this big call to action, almost to unify, right? Because as you said, with 14 parishes, everyone could look at that like, okay, we're 14 different versions. And yes, while that can be true, something else can also be true, which is that we can be one, right? There is beauty in that unity as well, right? We don't just have to lean into the division. So, I'm curious, what's been the feedback that you've gotten around this book? What are some of the nice things that really stand out in your mind that you've heard so far that confirm to you that, man, I executed this and I did a great job.
so I would say one of the things that some of the feedback, one of them coming from a mentor of mine, she actually like held my hand in the process of putting out my first book, and because of her, Claire, I would not be able to even do the second one. But one of the things she said, and it struck me, because she was like, this gives her PBS vibes, right? Like it felt very PBS Kids, and I was like, yeah, this it kind of is like that, you know.
Yeah.
Another thing that was very interesting. So like I also work as a registered behavioral tech. So I work with kids on the spectrum. And I brought the book. This was like during the summer when we had just finished, the whole project. The project was done. I ordered an author's copy and I brought it to work just so the kids could see it and my
Yeah.
coworkers could see it as well. And one of my coworkers was like, O is for, and I'm not gonna say what O is for. You guys would have to read the book to find out. But my coworker was like, I never in a million years would have expected to see that in a children's book for the letter O. And like she was just very excited. And one kid, and because like my picture is in the back of the book in the about the author page, but like one kid, he looked at it and he was like, I want to be Jamil. And
Oh,
this is a little boy who looks like me, comes from same country as me and everything. And so that really stuck with me, right? And a couple of kids kind of had like these like attachments to the book. I think part of it because they knew it was me and they're like, oh, I know him and I know this is his book, right? Like no other
mm,
book in the library has the author just sitting there with us every day. But then other kids were like, even kids who are from like the Latin Caribbean were like, oh, like platanos. I'm like, ah, yeah, fried plantains. Yes, fried plantain, platano, one and the same, right?
right.
I've also heard some feedback for and again like the intentionality. So the main character of the book's name is Jamal. My name is Jamil. Yes, they are connect. They're linked, right? Like that's what that is. But even the choice of how I designed the family. So Jamal comes from a mixed family. His mother is an Indo-Jamaican representation. His father is Afro-Jamaican representation. And then he has he has both sets of grandparents, right? And in that, you see him celebrating Eid with his mom's dad, but then also
Mm.
doing Pagwa with his mom's mom. You see him picking Aki with dad's dad and then making Dukunu with dad's mom, right? And I picked those things as like representations of like intergeneration, but then also the actual cultural aspects. Aki came from Africa, Dukunu came from Africa, or it has African roots. So why not have the Afro-Jamaican grandparents sharing those moments, right? And the same thing with the food items that I picked for Eid and for Pagwa. Why not have the Indian grandparents in those same bits, right? Even the clothing style, the fact that there's a big old 62 on the front of his shirt. 1962 is when we got our independence. Dad has a
Uh,
shirt with the Jamaican flag. Mom is wearing jumkas and bira, right? The cocoa pod bracelet. I have heard like a lot of things, even just about those minor details, folks saying, like they see themselves represented, right? For me, that was a really big thing, right? I wanted folks to be seen. I wanted, members of my family to see that and see a reflection of themselves. I tell folks it was hard because I really wanted to do R for roti, but R was for rice and peas because we're Jamaican, and at the end of the day, like rice and peas is rice and peas. But like a lot of the feedback that I've gotten was folks, saying that they learn some things, right? And for me, that was another aspect of it, was that educating in a way that both children and adults, some folks, each letter has one food item associated with it. And I had some folks ask, would it not have been possible to do two food items to maximize on what the child could learn from that, right? And I said, no, definitely. But also, this is an opportunity for you as the elder in the situation to have that conversation. Because even when I wrote the book, there were certain letters that I was stumped. And
okay.
I went to my mom and I went to my grandmother and I went to my aunts and I was like, hey, you know, what is like what can I put for this, right? And so some of those made it into the book, and I was like, I was proud of the fact that I was able to get that insight from my elders and incorporate that. And I look at my nieces and my nephews and my younger cousins, and I'm like, I'm glad that you guys have this book now, because like when we got to Gulgula, and even some of my Indian cousins were like, I've never heard of that. I was like, you need to call Aunt Herman. Talk to Aunt Herman.
Yeah.
Aunt Herman will give you the Gulgula recipe, the kurma recipe. Talk to Aunt Herman you know
Wow.
so I would say that's been a lot of the feedback, has been, it's been connecting folks to memories of some things that they had forgotten, some things
Mhm.
that they didn't know, seeing themselves represented again in the family dynamic. So I'm really happy about that.
Yeah, no, that's special. And I want to ask you about representation because I know that that's a big part of what you infuse into your work, and this being a prime example of that, right? Now, where my question comes from is, my family, for example, they got so many different, people from so many different parts and whatnot, right? And what I
Mhm.
do find at times is that when you do mix the people together, right? Sometimes it doesn't really, the energy of it all kind of insists that both can't coexist. You know what I mean? It's
Mm.
like one needs to dominate it, and then it's like the rest, or one is maybe forgotten, for lack of a better word, right? So, to me, I'm so intrigued that you did this, by actually allowing all sides to have their moment, to bring some things to the table and really reflect, what they have going on. Because I've only really seen where, whether it's an author or a person living out their life, they tend to think, I need to pledge allegiance to one, and I can't really do all of them. So I'm curious for you, like, what drives you when it comes to representation, and taking on this challenge? I think that's the best word to describe it. And clearly you champion this challenge, right, based on all the feedback and everything. But what really, like, was like the thing in your mind that, like, what, no matter how much I got to sit with this, it's so important for everyone to see themselves in this? Like what went through your mind as you were doing that through the creative process?
So my great grandmother is East Indian, right? And I never got the chance to meet her, but the oldest of my cousins who grew up with her would tell me how she used to tell Anansi stories,
Mm,
right? Let's put a pin in that one right there. My mom used to visit her, I guess that's her grand aunt, so her mother's aunt, so her grand
okay.
aunt, right? And Aunt Mays is a fully black Afro Jamaican woman who used to make dal and bat for my mom.
Okay.
That's point two. So here's my East Indian great grandmother telling her great grandchildren African spider stories. And here is my Afro Jamaican great great aunt feeding her grandnieces Indian food.
Wow.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, and I used to make this joke, like Jamaica's not a real place because where else do you find the children of African slavery and Indian indenture eating a poisonous fruit with saltfish for breakfast? Like, where does that happen, right? But
Yeah.
for me, like that's my family, right? Like it's funny because my like when I look at the family, right? So my great grandmother, my great grandfather was a black Jamaican man, right? So my grandmother and her siblings are mixed. But you have some others in that generation. So great one of my great aunts has four kids, two are full Indian, two are mixed. You
Hmm.
have the brother who married an East Indian woman, so all those children are Indian. And then the third sister also has mixed kids. So in that one line, you have like probably like half of those cousins are fully Indian and the other half are mixed, right? So but that's never been like a delineation amongst them. So even when I met my grandmother's first cousins for the first time and Aunt Herman and I got her number and we would talk, I remember like Aunt Herman was trying to like rack her brain around some certain things just about me and she was like, "So your mom is my cousin's daughter." And I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "Okay." And she's like, "Your father?" I said, "Yeah, no, he's fully Afro Jamaican. He's like, fully Afro Caribbean man." And she said, "So you're mixed." And in my head, I'm thinking about how like I get pushback when I identify certain ways. So I'm like, well, my grandma's mixed, but she married a black Jamaican, and then there's my mom, and then my dad's black. So, and she was like, "But no, but you're mixed." In her mind, she doesn't care about percentages. She's like, "You have Indian blood, and you have African blood. You're mixed, right?"
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
when we talk about like making sure like pledging those allegiances, right? I will wear a dashiki in February for Black History Month and put on a kurta in May for Asian Heritage Month. That's me, right? I've never been one to be like we have to do one or the other. And I'm glad that I come from a family that's never been like that, right? So I would say for me, I think about what that looks like and it's just knowing that I came from a family that we never did the halves and the wholes. If it was done, it was done in just to a point, right? But
Okay.
never to say this is how you define yourself, right?
Hmm.
And even then jokingly would say like, oh, like he's so tall, yeah, well, he gets it from that side because the other side is a bunch of short people, like it's always been things like that. So
Right.
I'm grateful that I came from a family where that was our norm. I know it's not the norm in some other families where I've met folks and they share how they did feel like they had to choose sides, and I'm just grateful that my family has never been of that mindset.
Yeah. I think that's so progressive and such a testament to how far, your family has come in like mindset and acceptance and love and all of those things, man. Because, for even in mine, like I'll say there's clear intolerance. Like I have no other word to refer to it. There's clear intolerance for certain elements and traits that you might associate with certain backgrounds within our family. And I think it's so wonderful. I do see when you've made your posts and when it's different times of the year and things like that. And I love the fact that you embrace all sides of yourself, right? I think that that's so special. And there's something so much like that you've taken your power back and like really, really owned your experience of life, like by being in the driver's seat. You know what I mean? Like I really, really admire that about you. And I'm so curious, how do you get received when you do that? Because I can imagine that there's a whole array of different responses that happen. And I can imagine myself in that position thinking, I just have a tremendous amount of responsibility to clearly communicate and not take the bait in case someone is trying to bait me straight up.
No, that's a great question. So honestly, it's funny because in the beginning, like there's a lot of pushback, right? Like I would get on like TikTok and make videos about, and I would say like like I remember one time I made a video and I prefaced it as saying like, as someone of Indo-Jamaican descent, I stated my opinion on the topic at hand, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I remember one very clear one being the identity of Prince Naveen from the Disney movie Princess and the Frog, right? Like the black community and the South Asian community were both laying claim, and I was like, as someone who sits in the middle, here's where I see both valid stances, but also I think it's crazy that we never got a clear-cut answer as to what his background was. But I had folks who were like, you present as one thing, so you should only identify as that one thing. And then I have folks who say, I hear folks say, like, as someone in the diaspora, right? I'm glad to see you still identify with these parts of your heritage because it gives me hope for my own children, and my own descendants, that they'll also hold on to that. And I think it varies. Some folks are surprised. So like folks who are like mainland South Asian are interested by the concept of Indian indenture. I think the topic of Indian indenture to the Caribbean and other parts of the world is becoming a more common topic. So, there was a time where like I would talk to folks and say, I didn't know that. I'd never heard of this before. And now when I bring it up, they're like, oh yeah, like, I know a Guyanese person, I know a Trinidadian, I didn't know they went to Jamaica. I'm like, yeah, man, Guyana first, then Jamaica, then Trinidad, Jamaica and Trinidad the same year, like 25 days apart, Guyana first. And then they're like, wow, that's crazy. And